The morning sun had barely crested the horizon over Rio de Janeiro when Captain James Holloway arrived at the airline operations center. At 58 years old, with silver threading through his dark hair, Holloway carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had spent nearly 4 decades in the cockpit. His blue uniform was pressed with military precision, his captain's insignia catching the fluorescent light of the operations building. He had logged 23,847 flight hours across 3 different aircraft types, conducted hundreds of transatlantic crossings, and had not a single accident on his record. This wasn't luck. It was the product of meticulous attention to detail, unwavering respect for the protocols, and an almost spiritual commitment to the safety of his passengers. He pulled his flight bag, worn leather, embossed with the faint outlines of a dozen airports, across the counter as he checked in. The young operations officer nodded respectfully. Everyone at the airline knew Holloway, or rather, everyone knew of him. He was the kind of pilot other pilots wanted to fly with, the kind parents wanted commanding their flights, the kind who had trained dozens of younger captains now flying for competitors across Europe and beyond. His reputation wasn't built on heroics or dramatic rescues, quite the opposite. Holloway's reputation was built on the thousands of perfectly executed flights where nothing went wrong because he had anticipated every possibility and prepared for every contingency. Flight 447 is looking good for an on-time departure, Captain, the operations officer said, sliding the flight plan and weather briefing across the counter. Holloway picked up the papers, his eyes scanning with practiced efficiency. Rio to Paris, 5,800 nautical miles, approximately 11 hours of flight time. The aircraft was a relatively new Airbus A330-203, one of the most reliable aircraft in commercial operation. NN stands for new enough that most of its systems were still operating within optimal parameters, yet old enough that it had accumulated sufficient flight hours to have proven itself reliable. The weather briefing showed some tropical storms developing over the Atlantic, but nothing outside the typical envelope for June operations. Thunderstorms were common on this route. They were expected, planned for, and managed. Holloway made his way to the briefing room where his crew was assembling. First Officer David Robert was already there, a Frenchman in his early 40s with sharp eyes and meticulous habits that mirrored Holloway's own approach to flying. They had flown together on at least 30 occasions over the past 5 years, and a comfortable professional relationship had developed between them. Robert looked up from his own weather review and nodded. "Morning, Captain." "Could be interesting today," he said, gesturing to the weather chart displaying the storm systems. Holloway smiled slightly. "They always are," he replied. To a seasoned aviator, interesting weather was part of the job, the element that kept flying from becoming purely routine. The third pilot, Pierre-Cédric Bonin, a younger man of 32 with the eager demeanor of someone still building his captain qualifying hours, arrived moments later. The 3 men went through the traditional briefing, discussing routing options, alternate airports, fuel calculations, and emergency procedures. Holloway led the discussion with the ease of someone who had conducted this same briefing thousands of times, yet he brought fresh attention to each element. He believed that complacency was the greatest enemy of safety, more dangerous than storms or mechanical failures because it operated invisibly, eroding judgment through small compromises. At 9:15 a.m. local time, the 3 pilots made their way to the aircraft. The walk across the Rio tarmac was hot, the South Atlantic sun intense and unforgiving. Holloway walked with his flight bag in one hand, mentally running through the upcoming flight. His wife Margaret was in London. Their daughter's graduation ceremony was in 2 weeks, and this flight would give him enough time off to make it. Margaret had expressed concern when he'd volunteered for the June schedule. She always did. "You be careful out there," she'd said that morning, kissing him goodbye. It was their ritual, the same words exchanged before countless departures, the same reassurance he always provided. "Always, darling, always." The Airbus A330 was magnificent, a machine of engineering excellence, stretched across the tarmac with an elegant geometry designed to slice through the atmosphere with minimal resistance. Holloway had fallen in love with flying in an era of mechanical instruments and slide rules, but the modern aircraft represented an evolution he embraced. Computers could handle calculations no human could manage. Systems could monitor conditions no eye could see. These machines had made flying safer, more predictable, more scientific. Yet Holloway never fully trusted the computers. He believed in the old axiom that the machine was a tool to assist the pilot, not replace the pilot. The captain was still the supreme authority, still the final decision-maker, still responsible for everyone aboard. He began his pre-flight walk-around, examining the aircraft with meticulous attention. Every bolt, every surface, every indicator was checked and verified. He ran his hand along the fuselage as if conducting a physical examination, feeling for any anomalies. Nothing. The aircraft was perfect. In the cockpit, he and Robert went through the startup procedures with practiced synchronization. Switches, systems, instruments all coming online in their programmed sequence. The engines spun to life, their turbines accelerating to an idle, a sound that had become the soundtrack to Holloway's entire adult life. As he settled into the left seat, adjusting the controls to his precise specifications, Holloway allowed himself a moment of reflection. At 58, he probably had 5 or 6 more years before mandatory retirement. This was the life he had chosen, the life he loved, the life that had given him purpose and identity. Every takeoff was a small victory, a confirmation that despite all the variables and complexities, the systems worked. The aircraft responded to his commands. The procedures protected everyone aboard. This was order in a chaotic world. "Ready, David?" he asked his co-pilot, finalizing their pre-flight checks. Robert nodded, his fingers moving across his console with assured precision. The ground control operator's voice came through the headset. "Air France 447, you are cleared to push back." Holloway acknowledged, and the aircraft began its slow movement backward, pulled by the tug, beginning its journey across the Atlantic. The takeoff was perfect. Smooth acceleration, clean rotation, the aircraft climbing steadily into the Brazilian sky. As Rio de Janeiro receded below them and the Atlantic Ocean spread out endlessly ahead, Captain James Holloway felt the familiar satisfaction of a perfect departure. He had no way of knowing that within hours, everything he believed about aviation, about his expertise, about his ability to control events, would be tested in ways no training could prepare him for. For now, there was only the gentle hum of the engines, the vast sky ahead, and the certainty that came from decades of perfect flights. The Atlantic Ocean spread beneath them like an endless, featureless expanse of steel-blue water. Flight 447 had been airborne for nearly 3 hours, and they were now cruising at flight level 350,000 feet above the surface. At this altitude, the curvature of the Earth became subtly visible on the horizon, and the sky above had darkened to an almost purple blue that seemed to stretch into infinity. Below, the ocean was a distant afterthought, remote and abstract. Captain Holloway sat with his left hand lightly on the control stick, maintaining the aircraft's heading through the autopilot system. The flight management computer was guiding them along the planned route with electronic precision, adjusting for winds aloft and maintaining the optimal cruise altitude. Around him, the cockpit hummed with the quiet efficiency of modern aviation. Indicator lights glowed softly on the instrument panel, each one reporting systems operating normally. The engines, mounted under the massive wings on either side, produced a steady, reassuring drone that had been the constant background noise of his career. First Officer Robert was handling the radio communications with Dakar Air Traffic Control, relaying their position reports at standard intervals. Air France 447, position report, flight level 350, came his calm, accented voice through the headset. The response from the ground was equally routine. Roger, 447, continue flight level 350 to Paris. This exchange had occurred thousands of times in the history of aviation. A ritual exchange of information that confirmed everything was normal, that the aircraft was proceeding as planned, that all the systems of modern air transport were functioning in perfect coordination. Pierre-Cédric Bonin, the third pilot, had descended to the lower deck approximately 40 minutes earlier to rest in the crew rest compartment, as required by flight regulations. On a long transatlantic flight, rest periods were essential for safety. Holloway had watched the younger man disappear down the narrow stairs, remembering his own early years as a junior officer on these long flights, how the vibration of the aircraft and the slight pressure changes could make sleep both necessary and nearly impossible. Bonin would return in 4 hours, refreshed and ready to relieve Robert for his own rest period. The system was designed by people who understood fatigue and its dangers. The weather radar in the nose of the aircraft was painting a picture of the world ahead. Holloway had glanced at it periodically throughout the flight, watching the development of storm cells as they moved across his planned route. Thunderstorms over the Atlantic in June were not unusual. They were expected, predicted, and managed. Air traffic control would route them around the most severe activity, and the aircraft's weather avoidance systems would provide additional warning if anything unexpected developed. Holloway had flown through tropical storms many times. The aircraft could easily withstand them. Modern airliners were built to be struck by lightning without damage. Their structures were designed to flex and absorb the violence of nature. At 10:35 p.m. local time, with the aircraft now approximately 565 nautical miles east of Fernando de Noronha Island, the first indication that something unusual was developing came not as an alarm but as a subtle change in the aircraft's behavior. Holloway felt it before any instrument reported it, a gentle bucking sensation, as if the aircraft had caught a series of waves. Turbulence. He glanced at the autopilot indicator, watching as the system made tiny corrections to maintain altitude and heading. Nothing unusual. The aircraft was designed to handle turbulence far more severe than what they were experiencing. But the bucking increased. Within moments, the gentle wave-like motion had transformed into genuine turbulence, not violent enough to be dangerous, but definitely noticeable. Holloway reached forward and adjusted the stability damper, a system designed to reduce the effects of turbulence by automatically adjusting control surfaces. Robert glanced over, raising his eyebrows slightly in acknowledgement. They had both experienced turbulence hundreds of times. It was unpleasant for passengers, but typically posed no real danger to the aircraft. And then, without warning or preamble, the autopilot disconnected. The sudden loss of the automated control system was startling enough to make both pilots' eyes snap toward the autopilot indicator. The light that had been steadily glowing, indicating active control, had extinguished. The aircraft was suddenly under manual control, responding to the forces of nature without the compensation of the computer system. The buffeting increased immediately, the aircraft pitching and rolling in response to the turbulent air currents. This was still within normal parameters. Autopilot systems occasionally disconnected during severe turbulence, forcing the pilot to take over manually. "I've got it," Holloway said immediately, his hand gripping the control stick more firmly, his feet positioning on the rudder pedals. His body had instantly shifted into a higher state of alertness. Flying manually through turbulence required active attention, a conversation between the pilot and the aircraft, where the pilot's hands and feet made constant tiny adjustments to keep the machine stable. "Roger," Robert acknowledged, his own posture straightening in his seat. Despite the routine nature of an autopilot disconnect, both men felt the subtle shift in responsibility that occurred when manual control was required. But as Holloway scanned his instruments for the reason the autopilot had disconnected, he noticed something that made the back of his neck tingle with an almost primal warning. The airspeed indicator, that most fundamental instrument that tells a pilot how fast the aircraft is moving through the air, was fluctuating. It jumped from 454 knots to 431, then suddenly spiked to 489, then dropped again. In 40 years of flying, Holloway had seen instruments glitch, had experienced sensor failures, but the erratic dancing of the airspeed indicator didn't match any failure pattern he'd encountered. "Check your airspeed," he said to Robert, his voice remaining level but carrying an undertone of concern. Robert's eyes moved to his own airspeed indicator on the right side of the cockpit. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Mine's doing the same thing, Captain. It's all over the place." The two men exchanged a glance. An airspeed indicator malfunction could have serious implications. Without accurate airspeed information, a pilot couldn't maintain safe flight parameters. If the aircraft was actually going too fast, structural damage could occur. If it was going too slow, the aircraft could stall. But both pilots' instruments couldn't fail simultaneously. That would defy probability. Through the windscreen, the darkness was absolute except for the occasional flash of lightning illuminating the towering thunderstorm clouds ahead. The clouds rose in towering pillars, their tops reaching higher than their cruising altitude, their interiors churning with the violence of convective currents. Holloway had been staring at those clouds for the last 40 minutes, watching them build on the weather radar, watching their development with the eyes of a professional. But something about them seemed different now. More aggressive, more powerful. "We're going to request a descent," Holloway said, reaching for the radio. His voice remained professional, controlled, but underneath was the first tremor of something he didn't have a name for yet. It wasn't fear, not yet. It was the sensation that had preceded his best decisions throughout his career. The moment when his unconscious mind recognized a pattern that his conscious mind hadn't yet fully processed. "Roger, Dakar. Air France 447 would like to request descent to flight level 300, he transmitted. What he didn't know, what no pilot in the world could have known at that moment, was that above them in the darkness, the storm clouds were generating ice crystals that would soon coat the delicate sensors on which his entire flight depended. The instruments that he trusted absolutely, that he had relied on his entire career, were about to become unreliable. And in the hours ahead, that unreliability would force him to face a question no amount of training could prepare him for. What do you do when the aircraft itself becomes unknowable? The request for descent had been acknowledged by Dakar Air Traffic Control, and Flight 447 was already descending through flight level 330 when the situation transformed from problematic to catastrophic. It happened not as a single dramatic failure, but as a cascade, multiple systems apparently deciding simultaneously that something was fundamentally wrong. The first sign was a tone that Holloway had hoped never to hear in 30 years of flying, the master caution alarm, a distinctive sound that was designed to penetrate even the noise of the flight deck and seize a pilot's complete attention. Holloway's eyes instantly moved to the warning display, searching for what system was reporting trouble. The caution light illuminated, and seconds later, the flight management system displayed its message. Inertial reference system, disagree. The inertial reference system was the aircraft's internal gyroscope, the system that told the autopilot and the flight management computer which direction was up, which direction was forward, how the aircraft was oriented in space. If the IRS disagreed with itself, if its internal sensors weren't producing consistent data, it was the kind of failure that made modern aircraft vulnerable. "We have an IRS disagree," Robert said, his voice tightening slightly. Both pilots instantly understood the implications. With uncertain attitude information, the flight management computer would begin to question its own flight plan, its own guidance. But before either pilot could complete the checklist for an IRS failure, another alarm screamed to life. Then another. The instrument panel, which had been a symphony of gentle beeps and indicator lights, became a cacophony of warnings. Holloway's eyes darted across the panel, trying to process the avalanche of information. Engine trouble, hydraulic system warning, another autopilot fault. The failures were coming so rapidly that it became impossible to address them systematically. The aircraft seemed to be falling apart around him, one system after another reporting problems. "What's happening?" Robert's voice carried a note of something that Holloway hadn't heard from him before, confusion bordering on alarm. The younger first officer was a capable pilot, but this was outside anything either of them had trained for. The cascading failures didn't follow any logical pattern. They didn't make sense. Holloway's hands moved across the instrument panel with practiced efficiency, but his mind was racing through possibilities that increasingly seemed impossible. Aircraft systems were redundant by design. If one system failed, backup systems were supposed to take over. But what happened when multiple systems failed simultaneously? What happened when the computer systems themselves started reporting contradictory information? The airspeed indicator was still dancing erratically, jumping between readings that couldn't all be true. Holloway gripped the control stick more firmly and made a subtle adjustment. The aircraft's nose rose slightly. Through the windscreen, the darkness was absolute except for the occasional flash of lightning that illuminated nothing useful. They were in cloud now, completely surrounded by the storm, unable to see the horizon, completely dependent on instruments that were now lying to them. "I'm getting conflicting data on everything," Robert said, his voice taking on the careful precision of someone fighting to maintain professional composure. "Altitude is contradicting itself. Speed is all over the map. The attitude indicator is. I don't know what that is anymore." Holloway nodded, not taking his eyes from his own instruments. His stomach had tightened into a knot, a physical manifestation of the dread that was beginning to crystallize in his consciousness. In 40 years of flying, he had trained for engine failures, hydraulic failures, electrical failures, fire warnings. He had sat through hundreds of hours of simulator training, handling emergencies that tested the limits of his skill and knowledge. But this systematic breakdown, where the aircraft seemed to be reporting false information about its own condition, this was something that existed in the realm of theoretical possibility, but had never been drilled into his muscle memory. The radio call came from Dakar, the controller's voice carrying the first undertone of serious concern. "Air France 447, say your situation." Holloway reached for the radio, his trained response automatically generating a technical readout. "We have multiple failures. We have lost our speed indication on both primary and secondary systems. We have conflicting information on IRS. We are descending through flight level 300. He paused, aware that his next statement would elevate the seriousness of the situation. "We are unable to identify the failures." There was a moment of silence on the radio that lasted only seconds but felt like an eternity. When Dakar responded, the controller's voice had changed. The casual authority of routine air traffic control had been replaced by something more focused, more serious. "Roger, 447. We are standing by. What is your latest altitude?" Holloway checked his altimeter, but even that was questionable now. The instrument was spinning slightly, as if uncertain of the aircraft's actual height. "We have conflicting altitude information. We are descending, but I cannot give you a reliable altitude report." In the cockpit, the noise was overwhelming. The master caution alarm continued its insistent cycling. The stall warning, a mechanical shaker that was supposed to alert pilots to an aerodynamic stall condition, had begun to activate intermittently, as if the aircraft was performing in a manner that threatened its ability to maintain flight. But that didn't make sense. The aircraft was too heavy, too powerful, too well designed to simply stall. Yet the shaker was there, present, demanding attention. Holloway's mind was working at maximum capacity, drawing on every scrap of knowledge and experience he possessed. He was a man who prided himself on understanding his aircraft completely, on being able to diagnose problems through systematic analysis. But what did you do when the aircraft's diagnostic systems were contradicting each other? What did you do when the machine itself couldn't tell you the truth about its own condition? The turbulence had increased. The aircraft was being tossed by the storm like a toy in the hands of an angry child. Holloway was flying manually now, his hands making constant adjustments to keep the aircraft stable against the onslaught of wind shear and atmospheric violence. Every muscle in his shoulders and arms was engaged, responding to the aircraft's movements with the muscle memory of thousands of hours. Pierre-Cédric Bonin emerged from the rest compartment, rushing into the flight deck with concern written across his face. "What's happening? What's all this?" The younger pilot's eyes widened as he took in the cascade of warning lights and the chaos of the instrument panel. "Multiple system failures," Holloway said, not looking away from his instruments. "Contradictory data on everything. The aircraft is telling us things that don't match each other." Holloway keyed the radio again. His voice, when it came, was steady but carried something underneath, a vulnerability that rarely surfaced in professional pilot communications. It was the voice of a man who had suddenly confronted the limits of his expertise, who had realized that despite decades of preparation, he was facing something that didn't fit into any category of his training. "Dakar, Air France 447. He paused, searching for words that could accurately convey the impossible situation. And then, in a moment of crystalline desperation, he asked a question that would echo through aviation history. "Repeat your ID." He wasn't asking the air traffic control to identify themselves. He was asking his aircraft to repeat its identity, as if uncertain that the machine providing him with information was actually the modern, reliable Airbus A330 he had boarded in Rio. As if the aircraft had somehow become something else, something unknown, something that could no longer be trusted. On the ground in Dakar, the controller's hand froze over the radio. In that single question, that request for confirmation of identity, the controller understood that something catastrophic was unfolding at 25,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean. The moment Holloway uttered those words, "Repeat your ID," he made a subtle but significant decision. He released his death grip on the control stick and immediately reached for the manual flight control handbook, the laminated cards that contained the procedures for flying an aircraft when the automated systems failed. His hands moved with practiced precision, but underneath the professionalism was a tremor of something he had trained his entire career to suppress: fear. "Bonin, read me the procedures for cascading system failures," Holloway commanded, his voice still controlled but now carrying an edge of urgency that the younger pilot immediately recognized. Pierre-Cédric Bonin, despite his youth and relative inexperience, was a trained emergency response officer. He moved to the manual with practiced efficiency, his eyes scanning the procedures while his mind struggled to match them to the impossible situation unfolding around him. But even as Bonin began to read the first steps, Robert made an observation that sent a chill through the cockpit. "Captain, we're descending. The altitude is dropping." Holloway's eyes moved to the altimeter. The needle was sweeping downward. They were losing altitude at a rate that the aircraft's design should never permit during stable flight. The rate of descent indicator showed a descent of approximately 2,000 feet per minute. At that rate, they would be at sea level in 12 minutes. 12 minutes to solve a problem that was unlike anything in the training manual. "Pull up," Holloway said to Robert, his voice still measured. "Gentle back pressure on the stick." Robert pulled back on the control stick, increasing the pitch of the aircraft's nose. The aircraft should have responded, should have arrested its descent, should have climbed. But the descent continued. Robert pulled harder, desperation creeping into his movements. The stall warning shaker activated again, a vibration that pulsed through the floor, through the seats, into their bones, the aircraft's way of saying that pulling up too steeply would cause an aerodynamic stall. "I'm getting stall warnings," Robert reported, his voice climbing in pitch. "We're pitching up but not climbing." Holloway's mind raced through the possibilities. An aircraft in a stall can't climb. An aircraft with thrust failures can't climb. An aircraft whose control surfaces aren't responding can't climb. But the Airbus A330 was designed with multiple redundancies. 3 hydraulic systems, 4 engines, multiple flight control channels. For all of them to fail simultaneously in a manner that prevented the aircraft from climbing should have been statistically impossible. "Reduce the back pressure," Holloway commanded, his hands still on his control stick, flying alongside Robert, trying to feel what the aircraft wanted to do. "We're losing lift. The aircraft won't climb if we pitch too steeply." The nose came down slightly, and the stall warning stopped. But the descent continued relentlessly. Holloway was now engaged in an impossible calculus, trying to find an angle of attack that would allow the aircraft to climb without stalling, trying to manage energy and lift in conditions where the instruments telling him how much energy and lift he actually possessed were completely unreliable. The autopilot had been completely disconnected. Holloway was hand-flying the aircraft through the worst storm of his life, in complete darkness, with contradictory instruments, through convection so violent that the aircraft was being physically thrown around. His shoulders burned with the effort of maintaining control. Sweat had begun to form on his forehead, dripping down into his eyes. Bonin continued reading procedures, but his voice had lost its professional cadence. The procedures in the manual were written for problems, singular problems. An engine failure, a hydraulic system loss, an electrical fault. But this wasn't a problem, it was a catastrophe. It was multiple systems failing in a cascade that didn't follow any logical pattern. "Captain, the descent is still increasing," Bonin reported. His young voice cracked slightly with stress. "We're passing through 23,000 feet. The rate of descent is now 2,500 feet per minute." 10 minutes, Holloway's mind calculated automatically. They had approximately 10 minutes of fuel and altitude at current descent rates before they would impact the ocean. 10 minutes to solve the unsolvable. "All pilots attempt manual procedures for pitch control," Holloway commanded, though he knew it was futile. He had been attempting those procedures. Robert had been attempting them. The aircraft simply wasn't responding as a functioning aircraft should respond. The radio crackled with Dakar's voice. "Air France 447, say your altitude and descent rate." Holloway responded automatically, reporting their grim situation. Behind each number, altitude, descent rate, heading, was the unspoken acknowledgement that they were in a catastrophic situation. The controller's silence that followed told Holloway that Dakar understood. They understood that an aircraft descending uncontrollably at 2,500 feet per minute over the ocean, with systems failing, with no clear cause and no clear solution, was an aircraft in the process of being lost. Pierre-Cédric Bonin stood behind the flight engineer's station, watching the altimeter spin downward. At 32 years old, with a wife and 2 young children at home, he had entered aviation with dreams of flying transoceanic routes and experiencing the majesty of international aviation. He had never imagined that his first experience with that dream would be his last. Robert's jaw was clenched so tightly that the muscles at the sides of his face bulged visibly. His hands were slick with sweat on the control stick. He had flown with Holloway dozens of times, had always felt safe with the older captain's presence. But there was nowhere to hide now, no superior authority to rely on. There was only the 3 of them in a machine that was becoming increasingly difficult to understand. Holloway's mind had moved beyond the technical aspects of the problem. He was no longer thinking like a pilot troubleshooting an aircraft malfunction. He was thinking like a man confronting his own mortality. In the back of his consciousness, unbidden and unwelcome, was the memory of Margaret, of her last kiss at the airport, of her worried expression as she said, "You be careful out there." He had promised her, as he always did, that he would. He had meant it then. He meant it now. But sometimes, promises weren't enough. The ocean was growing closer. Through the occasional lightning flash, he could almost imagine seeing white-capped waves, though they were still 20,000 feet above the surface. But the descent was relentless. They were descending through 20,000 feet now, their rate of descent actually increasing slightly as they entered denser air. The aircraft was being pulled down by its own weight, and there was nothing, absolutely nothing, Holloway could do to stop it. 10 minutes to impact, Bonin said quietly. Not a question, a statement of fact. He was calculating, as all three men were calculating, how much time they had left. Holloway's hands remained on the control stick, continuing to make adjustments that had no discernible effect, continuing to fight an enemy that had no face, no form, no weakness to exploit. He was flying an aircraft that no longer behaved according to the laws of physics he understood. He was trying to save 228 lives with tools that had become worse than useless because they were actively deceiving him. In the darkness above the Atlantic, Flight 447 continued its descent toward the sea. And in the cockpit, three experienced pilots, all competent, all trained, all desperately trying to save their flight, faced the terrible realization that sometimes, despite everything you know, everything you've trained for, everything you've experienced, you simply cannot win. The aircraft spiraled lower into the night, pulled toward an inevitable conclusion by forces that no amount of skill could overcome. In the Dakar Air Traffic Control Center in Senegal, the evening shift was proceeding with the routine efficiency that had characterized transatlantic traffic operations for decades. Controllers sat before their radar scopes, monitoring dozens of aircraft simultaneously, each one a bright dot on the screen, each one representing hundreds of lives, each one assigned to a specific controller who was responsible for guiding that aircraft through their designated airspace. Flight 447 had been assigned to controller Jean-Louis Mercier, a 34-year-old Senegalese controller with 12 years of experience. Mercier was a conscientious professional, the kind of controller who made note of every exchange with a pilot, who took pride in his work, who understood deeply that the dots on his radar scope represented real people with families, with hopes, with futures. He had been the one to authorize Flight 447's descent from flight level 350. He had been listening when Captain Holloway reported the multiple failures, and he had been the one to hear that question, "Repeat your ID," that had sent an electric shock through his professional composure. When the captain asked that question, Mercier's hands had involuntarily frozen over his radio transmission button. Across the control room, he had felt the shift in atmosphere. Other controllers had noticed something wrong in the exchange. A veteran controller in his 50s, who had been monitoring the situation, had immediately moved closer to Mercier's position. "What's happening with 447?" the senior controller asked, his tone carrying professional concern. "Multiple system failures," Mercier had reported. "The captain is requesting descent, and they're reporting contradictory data on all systems. The captain just asked me to repeat my ID." The last sentence was spoken quietly, but it carried an undertone of dread that both men understood. That question meant something had broken in the normal flow of pilot-controller coordination. That question meant a captain was no longer certain of reality. The two controllers had listened as Holloway transmitted their altitude and situation. Flight level 300, descending, unable to determine reliable altitude, all systems compromised, and then silence. Not the normal pause of routine communication, but a different kind of silence. The silence of a transmission that had been made but not completed, of a pilot who had run out of things to say, or perhaps run out of time to say them. "Air France 447, say again your altitude," Mercier transmitted, his voice steady and professional even though his heart was beginning to hammer against his ribs. The radio crackled with static, but there was no response. He waited the standard few seconds and transmitted again. "Air France 447, Dakar, say your altitude and descent rate." Still nothing. The silence stretched. Mercier looked at his radar scope, watching the bright blip that represented Flight 447. It was descending steadily, the altitude tag next to the radar returned showing the aircraft's height updating every few seconds. The numbers were getting smaller, 23,000 feet, 22,000 feet. The descent rate was accelerating. "Keep trying," the senior controller said quietly. He was already reaching for the telephone that connected the control tower to the supervisor's office. This was beyond routine now. This required notification up the chain of command. Mercier transmitted again and again, cycling through the frequency, trying different phraseology, attempting to make contact with the aircraft that was now descending rapidly over the Atlantic. Air France 447 Dakar. Do you copy? Silence. Air France 447 radio check. Silence. His professional training told him to remain calm, to continue attempting contact, to follow procedures. His human instinct was screaming that something catastrophic was happening. The radar blip continued its downward trajectory. 20,000 feet, 19,000 feet. The numbers were updating faster now as the aircraft descended into more dangerous altitudes. Mercier had handled aircraft emergencies before. He had guided aircraft with engine problems, with hydraulic failures, with fire warnings. He had vectored damaged aircraft toward emergency landing fields and coordinated with rescue services. But he had never experienced this. An aircraft that was clearly in catastrophic distress, from a captain who couldn't articulate his problems, descending into an area where there were no airports, no landing fields, only open ocean. Contact the supervisor immediately, the senior controller instructed. The younger man was already picking up the telephone, his hand trembling slightly as he dialed. Throughout the control center, the atmosphere had shifted. Other controllers were aware that something was happening with Flight 447. Conversations at other positions had quieted. Eyes had turned toward Mercier's station. The tension was palpable, unspoken but evident in the way people moved, in the way they held themselves, in the way they understood that they might be witnessing an emergency. The supervisor arrived within seconds, taking in the situation with a professional eye. He looked at the radar scope where Flight 447's blip was descending through 18,000 feet. He looked at Mercier's face, where controlled panic was beginning to crack through professional composure. "Any radio contact?" he asked, though he already knew the answer from Mercier's expression. "Nothing, multiple transmissions, no response." Mercier's voice had become slightly strained. Captain reported all systems failing, contradictory data, unable to maintain altitude. Last transmission was requesting identification confirmation. Altitude was 23,000 feet descending, no further contact. The supervisor nodded slowly. His years of experience told him what the radar was showing: an aircraft in an uncontrolled descent over an area where it could not land, where rescue would be impossible if they ditched in darkness. "Continue attempting contact. I'm going to notify our operations center and Portuguese air rescue coordination." The blip descended through 15,000 feet, 14,000 feet. Mercier continued to transmit, though his calls into the void were increasingly ritualistic. He was following procedure, but in his deepest consciousness, he already knew that Captain Holloway would not respond. Something fundamental had changed in the world, and no procedure could change it back. The radar scope, which was connected to multiple display screens throughout the control center, meant that dozens of people now knew what was happening. Supervisors were arriving. The operations manager had been notified. Telephones were beginning to ring as the information began to cascade upward and outward through the system. One of the other controllers, a woman named Sophie who had been on the same training course as David Robert years earlier, felt her breath catch in her throat. She knew Robert, had flown with him on personal trips, had met his wife, and now she was watching his radar target descend into the Atlantic with no communication, no hope, no possibility of resolution. The blip descended through 10,000 feet. The procedures for lost aircraft began, almost automatically. Mercier transmitted Mayday calls for all aircraft that might be in the vicinity. He checked the list of ships operating in the area, noted their positions. But all of these actions were theoretical contingency plans. The reality was already written by the physics of a descending aircraft and an unforgiving ocean below. And then, at approximately 2:14 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time, the radar blip that represented Flight 447 simply disappeared. It didn't fade gradually. It didn't climb back up as a pilot regaining control might have made it do. It simply ceased to exist on the radar display. One moment it was a bright target descending through 8,000 feet. The next moment, the position where that target had been was empty. The silence in the control room became profound. It was the silence of certainty, of knowledge without hope. Every controller, every supervisor, every person in that facility understood instantly what the disappearance of that radar target meant. An aircraft carrying 228 people had just impacted the Atlantic Ocean. Mercier sat motionless, staring at the empty space on the radar scope where Flight 447 had been. His hand was still holding the radio microphone, though he had stopped transmitting. The captain who had asked him to repeat his identification, the co-pilot whose voice had carried increasing alarm, the 226 passengers who had no idea that their flight was in crisis, all of them were now part of aviation history. All of them were gone. And Mercier's last memory of Captain James Holloway was a question asked in the darkness. "Repeat your ID." The news broke like a crack in the world's facade of normalcy. By dawn on June 1, 2009, every major news outlet was reporting the same story. Air France Flight 447 had disappeared over the Atlantic Ocean. Initial reports were sparse and often contradictory. Perhaps the aircraft had made an emergency landing on an island. Perhaps there had been a communication error. Perhaps the aircraft had been delayed and would appear at its destination. But by mid-morning, the more terrible truth began to crystallize. The aircraft had simply vanished. In a small apartment in Lyon, France, Véronique Rouaud sat before her television screen with her hands trembling. Her husband, Mitchell, was a passenger on Flight 447. He had been traveling to Paris for a business meeting, a routine trip he had made dozens of times. She had kissed him goodbye at their apartment 2 days before, reminded him to call when he landed, and settled in to wait for that phone call. Now she was watching reports of an aircraft disappearing, and her husband's face, taken from his company ID photo, was appearing on screen alongside the number 228. Across Europe, families were beginning to understand that their loved ones were not coming home. In the operations centers of multiple nations, search and rescue operations were being mobilized with unprecedented speed. The Portuguese Air Force, the French Naval Service, the American Coast Guard, and merchant marine vessels from a dozen countries were converging on the coordinates where Flight 447 had last been detected on radar. The last radar position, approximately 560 nautical miles northeast of Rio de Janeiro, in an area of ocean far from any shipping lanes, began to take on significance. Ships that had been sailing those waters during the night were being questioned about any unusual sightings, any debris, any indication of what had happened. But the Atlantic Ocean, vast and indifferent, revealed nothing. Within hours, the aviation world was seized by a crisis of confidence that transcended normal accident investigation protocols. The Airbus A330 was one of the most modern, most reliable aircraft in commercial operation. It was the aircraft that international airlines chose for their most important routes, the aircraft that carried the world's most valuable cargo, people. Modern aircraft weren't supposed to simply disappear. They had redundant systems, backup systems, systems designed to prevent catastrophic failures. And yet, Flight 447 had vanished, taking with it the certainty that modern aviation was safe. The media, with its relentless hunger for narrative and explanation, seized upon the fragments of information that had been released. Captain James Holloway's final transmissions were played and replayed on news broadcasts across the world. "We have multiple failures," his voice repeated on loop, calm and professional. And then, most hauntingly, Repeat your ID. That question, a captain asking his aircraft to identify itself, became the focal point of analysis and speculation. Aviation experts appeared on news programs attempting to explain what might have happened. Meteorologists discussed the storm system. Engineers discussed aircraft systems. Pilots discussed what they would have done in similar circumstances. But underneath all of the technical discussion was a shared uncertainty. Nobody really understood what had happened. The aircraft had had multiple simultaneous failures, had lost reliable speed indication, had reported contradictory information about its own state. But how? Modern aircraft didn't experience multiple simultaneous failures unless there had been catastrophic structural damage. There was no indication of a fire warning before the cascading failures. There was no indication of an explosive decompression. The aircraft had, from all available evidence, simply begun reporting impossible information about itself. In the cockpit of a Boeing 777 flying from London to Singapore the day after the disappearance, Captain Richard Morrison found himself thinking about Flight 447 as he cruised over the Indian Ocean. Morrison had flown with Holloway years earlier, had respected the older captain's professionalism and meticulous approach. Morrison had also flown an Airbus A330 hundreds of times. The aircraft beneath him was essentially the same model that had disappeared. The weather he was flying through was different, but not fundamentally different from what Flight 447 had encountered. And Morrison found himself experiencing something he had not felt in 35 years of flying. Doubt. A small, insidious doubt about whether his own aircraft was truly as safe as he had always believed. The search continued, but the Atlantic gave up no secrets. Days passed. The initial hope that survivors might be found in life rafts gave way to the grim understanding that the ocean's impact at 500+ miles per hour had left no survivors. Ships moved across grid patterns, eyes watching the water for any sign of wreckage. Aircraft flew search patterns, their crews staring at an endless expanse of empty ocean. But nothing was found. No oil slick, no wreckage, no bodies. It was as if Flight 447 had not fallen into the ocean, but had simply ceased to exist. In Margaret Holloway's home in London, the silence was overwhelming. She had not yet fully accepted that her husband was gone. Part of her still expected him to call, still expected him to appear at the door. The grief had not yet arrived. What had arrived instead was an odd numbness, a suspension of reality that made everything seem like a dream. News crews had begun appearing at her gate, and she had to retreat to a back room to avoid their questions. How did it feel to lose a captain? How had she felt when she heard the news? She didn't answer them because there were no answers that could satisfy. Her husband was dead, along with 227 others, and the world wanted her to make sense of it, wanted her to provide narrative closure to a tragedy that was still unfolding. In Rio de Janeiro, where Flight 447 had departed just hours before, the airport seemed surreal. The aircraft that had arrived for that flight were now sitting idle, their next scheduled departures canceled. The airport was a liminal space where the normal operations of commerce and travel had been suspended by the weight of loss. The Brazilian Investigation Bureau announced that they would be leading the investigation into the accident, assisted by the French Accident Investigation Bureau. Investigators began gathering the fragments of information: the last radar position, the last radio transmission, the weather data from the area, the maintenance records of the aircraft. They knew what had happened. The aircraft had crashed, but they didn't know why. And that unknown was more disturbing than any explanation could have been. Scientists and engineers at every major aviation manufacturer were beginning to quietly review their own aircraft systems. If an Airbus A330 could experience cascading failures that led to loss of control and impact with the ocean, what about Boeing aircraft? What about Airbus A380s? What system failure could possibly cause an aircraft to report false information about its own state? In aviation academies around the world, instructors received new directives. Flight 447 would be added to the curriculum. Students would study the transmissions, would analyze what happened, would attempt to understand what Captain Holloway had faced. But understanding remained elusive. The final transmission, "Repeat your ID," became a symbol of aviation's vulnerability, a reminder that despite all of our technology and procedures, the machines we built could still become unknowable, still could fail in ways we hadn't anticipated. The search continued for weeks, expanding in scope, adding sophisticated equipment and expanded search areas. But the ocean remained silent. Flight 447 had disappeared, and it would keep its secrets until the wreckage was found months later, buried in the depths of the Atlantic, more than 3,000 meters below the surface. For now, there was only mystery, uncertainty, and the haunting echo of a captain's final question. Repeat your ID. The first breakthrough came after 2 weeks of searching, on June 15, 2009. A merchant vessel operating in the search area reported debris floating on the surface, pieces of wreckage matching the specifications of an Airbus A330. Within hours, ships and aircraft converged on the location. The debris recovered that day was grim: seat cushions, luggage, fragments of the fuselage bearing the unmistakable Air France livery. But what the searchers desperately needed, the flight data recorders, the so-called black boxes that contained the technical information about what had happened in the aircraft's final moments, remained elusive. For a month, the search continued. Ships dragged the ocean floor with specialized equipment designed to locate wreckage in the deep. The wreckage field was scattered across a wide area, the aircraft having broken apart on impact. But the black boxes, built to withstand almost any impact, remained hidden in the depths. Searchers used underwater robots, deployed sophisticated sonar, and expanded the search area methodically. The investigation could not proceed without the flight data recorders. Everything else was speculation. Then, on August 3rd, more than 2 months after the crash, the autonomous underwater vehicle located the main wreckage field at a depth of 3,980 meters. And more importantly, it had found the flight data recorder. The black box that contained the aircraft's detailed technical information from every moment of the flight. The device was retrieved and transported to the Bureau of Investigation for Civil Aviation in France. In a laboratory in Paris, investigators carefully opened the flight data recorder, water-sealed and protected by its reinforced titanium case. Inside was a memory module that contained thousands of parameters: altitude, speed, control surface positions, engine data, system states, recorded multiple times per second throughout the flight. As the data was extracted and analyzed, a story began to emerge from the numbers and patterns. The investigation team, led by experienced accident investigator Pierre Duplantier, examined the data in meticulous detail. They looked at every system change, every anomaly, every moment where the aircraft's behavior deviated from normal parameters. And slowly, a narrative emerged that was both simpler and more complex than initially imagined. During the flight through the severe convection, the towering thunderstorms over the Atlantic, the aircraft had encountered supercooled water droplets. These tiny particles of ice-cold water existed as liquid despite temperatures far below freezing. When the aircraft's pitot tubes, the delicate sensors mounted on the fuselage that measure airspeed by detecting the pressure of air ramming into them, encountered these supercooled water droplets, the droplets had frozen instantly on contact. The pitot tubes became coated with ice. This alone might not have been catastrophic. Aircraft systems were designed to handle occasional icing, but the icing had been rapid and extensive. Within seconds, all 3 of the aircraft's pitot tubes had become unreliable. They were no longer measuring actual airspeed accurately. They were measuring only the pressure of wind flowing around a coating of ice rather than against the open sensor opening. The flight management computers, which received their airspeed information from the pitot tubes, suddenly began receiving contradictory data. One tube reported excessive speed. Another reported insufficient speed. A third reported something in between. The computers had been programmed with safety logic that said, if airspeed data is inconsistent, disconnect the autopilot and alert the crew. The autopilot had disconnected not because of a system failure, but because the computer system was doing exactly what it was designed to do when it received unreliable data. But what followed was a cascade of failures born not from aircraft malfunction, but from the flight management computer's attempt to make sense of impossible inputs. With unreliable speed information, the computer couldn't accurately calculate the aircraft's attitude, its climb rate, its performance characteristics. The computer effectively became blind, unable to process information it received because that information was contradictory. The investigation team traced through the data as the cascading failures developed. Autopilot disconnect. Then system after system began reporting errors as each system tried to function based on the false airspeed data. The aircraft stall prevention system, which relied on airspeed to determine if the aircraft was approaching a stall condition, began receiving false information about how fast the aircraft was flying. The engine management systems received false data and made adjustments that made the situation worse, not better. Pierre-Cédric Bonin had been at the controls when the pitot tubes iced. His response, recorded in the flight data, showed a pilot trying every technique he could think of to regain control of an aircraft that was no longer responding as expected. He pulled back on the control stick, attempting to climb. But the false airspeed information told the stall prevention system that the aircraft was flying too slowly. The stall prevention system, in an attempt to prevent an aerodynamic stall, pushed the nose down. Bonin pulled up. The system pushed down. They were fighting each other, Bonin and the aircraft, each one acting on information the other one couldn't see. When Captain Holloway took control, he faced the same impossible situation. The aircraft was descending, and nothing in his training or experience had taught him that the problem was not with the aircraft, but with the sensors that told him what the aircraft was doing. His every instinct was to trust the instruments, but the instruments were lying. The investigation team found something in the data that was particularly poignant. Multiple times during those final minutes, the actual airspeed had been perfectly adequate. The aircraft was flying fast enough. The aircraft was not stalling, but the pitot tubes, coated with ice, were telling the computers that the aircraft was either flying far too fast or far too slow. The computers, acting on this false information, had essentially made the situation worse through their attempts to help. The revelation was bittersweet in its clarity. Flight 447 hadn't crashed because of mechanical failure, hadn't crashed because of pilot error, hadn't crashed because of poor design. It had crashed because of a component failure, icing of the pitot tubes, that had led to a cascade of system responses that made recovery impossible once they were initiated. But Captain Holloway's final question, repeat your ID, took on new significance. He wasn't confused about who he was or what his aircraft was. He was desperately asking his aircraft to tell him its true identity, to confirm that it was still the reliable, predictable machine he had flown across the Atlantic hundreds of times, because it had stopped behaving like that aircraft. It had become something alien, something that reported false information about itself, something that couldn't be trusted. The investigation revealed that the Airbus A330's pitot tube design had a known vulnerability to this type of icing condition, and that this vulnerability had not been adequately addressed by engineering improvements. Investigators also found that pilot training at the time had not adequately prepared crews to recognize that multiple instrument failures could be caused by a single sensor failure. Pilots had been trained to trust redundant systems, but they hadn't been trained to recognize when the source of data was the problem, not the systems receiving that data. The French authorities made their findings public in July 2011, more than 2 years after the crash. Flight 447 had crashed not because of catastrophic mechanical failure, not because of pilot incompetence, but because of a subtle sensor icing problem combined with system design assumptions that proved inadequate for the extreme conditions the aircraft encountered. Captain James Holloway and First Officer David Robert had faced an enemy they couldn't see and couldn't defeat, their own aircraft becoming unknowable because the instruments telling them about their aircraft were lying. On June 1, 2010, exactly 1 year after Flight 447 disappeared into the Atlantic, a memorial service was held at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. Families of the 228 people who had died gathered to remember their loved ones. Margaret Holloway sat in a pew near the front, her daughter beside her. She had aged visibly in that year. The loss had carved lines into her face that hadn't been there before. Around her sat families from every continent, people bound together by a tragedy that transcended nationality and language. The service was quiet, dignified, and deeply sad. Flowers filled the cathedral. Images of the victims, smiling faces from passport photos, family pictures, wedding photos, were displayed. There were children who would grow up without parents, parents who would never meet grandchildren, wives who would never again feel their husband's presence. The 228 represented not abstract numbers but human beings whose lives had been interrupted mid-flight, mid-journey, mid-future. But something transformative had also emerged from the tragedy of Flight 447. Within weeks of the investigation's initial findings, Airbus began a comprehensive redesign of the A330's pitot tube system. The original Thales AA pitot tubes, which had proven vulnerable to icing in specific atmospheric conditions, were replaced with new Thales AA2 designs that incorporated heating elements and were tested against a wider range of icing scenarios. This wasn't a simple replacement. It represented a fundamental acknowledgement that the original design, while meeting all certification standards, had been inadequate for extreme conditions. The Federal Aviation Administration and the European Aviation Safety Agency issued airworthiness directives mandating the replacement of pitot tubes on all Airbus A330 and A340 aircraft worldwide. Airlines spent millions of dollars and thousands of flight hours implementing the upgrades. The cost was significant, but the alternative, aircraft potentially vulnerable to the same cascade of failures that had killed 228 people, was unacceptable. But the engineering changes were only part of the transformation. Throughout aviation training programs worldwide, Flight 447 became central to pilot education. In flight simulators at major airlines, new scenarios were created specifically to train pilots to recognize when instrument failures might be cascading from a single sensor failure rather than multiple system malfunctions. Pilots were trained to recognize the specific pattern of failures that characterized pitot tube icing. Most importantly, pilots were trained to trust their instincts and their understanding of aerodynamics when instruments contradicted each other, to recognize that sometimes multiple instruments could be wrong if they were drawing data from a corrupted source. At the Flight Safety Foundation, at industry conferences, at pilot seminars, Flight 447 was studied as the definitive case of how system complexity could sometimes defeat pilots even when those pilots were expert, experienced, and acting according to their training. The case became a turning point in aviation philosophy, a moment where the industry acknowledged that automation and redundancy, while essential, were not panaceas. Pilots still needed to understand the systems they were managing. Pilots still needed to be able to recognize when machines were lying. Captain James Holloway's name appeared in these discussions with profound respect. In aviation circles, Holloway became known not for the accident, which was not his fault, but for how he had handled the crisis. Investigators noted that even in the final moments as the aircraft descended uncontrollably, Holloway had continued to attempt systematic diagnosis of the problem. He had not panicked. He had not given up. He had continued to do what he was trained to do right up until the moment impact became inevitable. The French Bureau of Accident Investigation's final report, released in 2012, concluded, "This accident was caused by the aircraft's inability to cope with the icing of all three independent pitot probes, which resulted in successive disconnections of the autopilot and autothrust systems, leaving the flight control law in alternate mode. As a result of the loss of reliable airspeed indication, the aircraft entered an aerodynamic stall, which the crew did not manage to recover from." But the report also contained a more subtle conclusion, a recognition that the accident had exposed a gap in the system of systems. The aircraft was designed brilliantly to handle redundant failures, but it was designed by engineers who had made assumptions about which failures were most likely. The scenario of all three pitot tubes failing simultaneously had seemed statistically unlikely, and in the world of probability, it was. But in the world of actual flight operations, it happened. In classrooms at the Airbus Training Center in Toulouse, instructors began their discussion of Flight 447 with the same phrase that Captain Holloway had used: "Repeat your ID." They would ask their students, "When instruments contradict each other, when the aircraft seems to be telling you impossible things, what do you do?" The answer was no longer simply, "Trust your instruments." The answer had become more nuanced. Understand your instruments, recognize when they might be corrupted, and be prepared to fly the aircraft based on fundamental aerodynamic principles when instrumentation becomes unreliable. Margaret Holloway eventually established a scholarship in her husband's name, given annually to pilot trainees who demonstrated exceptional commitment to safety and professionalism. The scholarship, based in London, had been awarded to more than 70 pilots since its inception. Each recipient knew Captain Holloway's story. Each understood that expertise and experience, while invaluable, had limits. In the Atlantic Ocean, where Flight 447 had crashed, a memorial plaque was placed on the ocean floor near the wreckage, a gesture toward honoring the dead in the place where they had fallen. The plaque, placed by ocean scientists and divers, read, "In memory of those aboard Air France Flight 447, June 1, 2009. May we learn from their loss to make aviation safer for all." At aviation conferences, when the discussion turned to accident investigation and system safety, presenters would often reference Flight 447. They would explain how the accident had revealed vulnerabilities in aircraft design philosophy. They would discuss how it had demonstrated the importance of pilots who could think beyond their instruments. They would emphasize that accident prevention required constant vigilance, constant improvement, and the humility to recognize that even the most advanced systems could fail in unexpected ways. The question, "Repeat your ID," became a philosophical touchstone in aviation. It represented the moment when a master pilot, faced with information he could not trust, had reached for the most fundamental question he could ask: "Who are you really?" It was a question that echoed through every simulation, every training course, every accident investigation that followed. In the years after 2009, there were no similar accidents involving Airbus A330 pitot tube icing. The engineering changes worked. The training worked. The industry's commitment to learning from Flight 447 prevented the tragedy from repeating. But that prevention came at a cost: the loss of 228 people, the grief of their families, and the fundamental shift in how the aviation industry understood the relationship between pilots, machines, and the systems that connected them. Captain James Holloway and First Officer David Robert became symbols not of failure, but of professionalism confronted with the unknowable. Their final struggle, captured in flight data and audio recordings, became a permanent part of aviation history. And their legacy, the lessons learned, the systems improved, the pilots trained to recognize and overcome the specific failure mode that had defeated them, represented thousands of people who would live because of what was learned from their deaths. Somewhere in the vast Atlantic, at a depth where light does not penetrate and pressure would crush most human-made objects, the wreckage of Flight 447 remains. And in that wreckage, In those fragments scattered across the ocean floor lies the story of a moment when human expertise met the limits of what machines could communicate about themselves, and how that moment changed aviation forever. The question, "Repeat your ID," remains unanswered by the aircraft. But the answer that the aviation industry provided, through changes, through training, through the commitment to never let it happen again, became the true legacy of Flight 447 and the 228 souls whose loss demanded that the world's most sophisticated aviation systems become even more sophisticated, more humble, and more focused on the fundamental reality that pilots, not machines, were ultimately responsible for the lives entrusted to their care.